Before we get started, we'd like to thank our sponsor, which is UT's Extended Campus. Extended Campus offers graduate programs, professional certificates, and skill building courses to support your career goals, no matter what your next step is. Texas X's members get a 10 to 25% discount on non-credit professional education courses. You can learn more at the link that we'll drop in the chat right now. So today, we're very fortunate to be joined by Dr. Anne Collins-Johns, a distinguished senior lecturer in the Department of Art and Art History at UT's College of Fine Arts. She received her PhD right here from the University of Texas at Austin, and her research focuses on medieval and Renaissance art and architecture of Siena and the role of monasticism in the arts of this period. She has won many, many teaching awards, including the President's Associates Teaching Excellence Award in 2018. Please welcome Dr. Johns.
Thank you very much, Dorothy. I am happy to be here today. I am talking today about the Jubilee and the Papal Jubilee, art, spectacle, and history. And in fact, I just got back from Rome a couple of weeks ago, or I got back from Italy. And so much of this is very fresh in my mind. Just to let you know, as Dorothy said, my own area of expertise is on the earlier end and medieval and Renaissance art history and religious history. But I was just there. I am a self-professed lapsed Catholic, so I'm, steeped in some of these traditions. And I go every year to Italy with all of these fresh faces, 25 of our UT students. And so I thought it would be interesting to think about this concept of Jubilee, both in terms of its history and so what it means now. And these are photos from when we were there. These are photos from early June. And they had, I'm sure many of you have probably been to Rome. Maybe some of you have even been on Jubilee. And this is the Jubilee Lane, the central pilgrimage lane here. You can see here a group of nuns. Everybody carries this standard Jubilee crucifix in. And then here's my own sort of ragtag group of UT students, 25 of them, who make their own pilgrimage of sorts while we are there. I'd like to say that this extraordinary photo of these nuns here is by my colleague Eli Durst, who I teach an art history class. He teaches a photography class. He, in fact, just received the Guggenheim Award for this year and is particularly also interested in issues of religion in more in contemporary setting. Okay, so the title, maybe the real title of this should have been Jubilee Then and Now, because again, I'm mostly an historian, and so I like to think about where these things come up. And the very first Jubilee is Christian Jubilee, is in the year 1300, which is right smack dab in the middle of the period of time that I work on. And so here are some of the issues that I want to address today. I want to address, what is the Jubilee, the Jewish origins, the medieval origins, Jubilee as pilgrimage, all of these sorts of things. I teach a class on Dante and the arts, and so we'll talk a little bit about Dante, and then bring us into the present day and sort of what it means to go on pilgrimage or Jubilee, and what is sort of the end goal of these people going. And this could be the case for this great image here of some medieval pilgrims, and then these are pilgrims from this most recent of Jubilees. And then finally, I'd like to end up with this idea of the experience of Jubilee and pilgrimage and what it can mean. I'm particularly interested in what it means to my own students. This is not a religious experience, this study abroad trip that I take with them, but how we can take some of this experience of the Jubilee with us when we in our own travels. So the Jubilee, the Christian Jubilee, is called by the Pope. Okay, and that's He gets to do it. And this is actually an image of Pope Francis from an extraordinary special jubilee that he called in 2015, the Jubilee of Mercy. And that is not, as we'll find out, a normal year. They are usually go in years of 25. But here he is at the Holy Doors of St. Peter's, and we're going to talk about the Holy Doors. They are very important in this concept of Jubilee. But the Pope is the person who decides about this, and you can see that he, he is. This is actually this picture is from 2015. This letter is from the more recent Jubilee that he called, of course, before he passed away, and this is the Jubilee of Hope, Pilgrims of Hope. And I think it was a very poignant message to people because we do live in a very war-torn world and a lot of unrest. And so, he saw it in spiritual ways, but I think we can think about it in terms of sort of our own ideas about hope. Now, Jubilee actually was a Jewish tradition first. It comes from the idea of the jobel or the shofar, the ram's horn that is sounded on Yom Kippur. And the Jewish Jubilee was quite complicated. It was every 7 years, times 7, 49 years, and then there would be a year after that that was a Jubilee. And it was kind of like a mega Sabbath. You weren't really supposed to do much. As you can see here, you're not supposed to sow, you don't reap what grows of itself, you don't harvest the untended vines. And so it was this idea of a time to reflect and rest and renew your sense of spirituality. This is taken up for the very first time in Christianity in the year 1300, and by the Pope Boniface VIII, who we can see here over on the right is a remnant of the original fresco painting that's now still in Rome, very badly damaged. And on the left is a watercolor that someone made of this in the early 1600s before they demolished and rebuilt St. John Lateran in Rome. And so Boniface decides with great hoopla to create this Jubilee. And what we're going to see is that Boniface is a very polarizing figure. He was Dante's great nemesis in the Divine Comedy, and but he had a very important role to play in all of this. So Jubilee basically is just an extraordinary pilgrimage. So we have to think about what this notion of pilgrimage is. And pilgrimage is a very important concept for people of all eras and of all religions. It is one that is certainly very central to most religions. The idea that you would go somewhere to renew your faith, to see some tangible evidence of your God, this sort of thing. So this is very important. So pilgrimage begins very early on in Christianity, and there are three big ones that developed in the Middle Ages. One is the pilgrimage, of course, to Jerusalem. That makes the most sense, to the Holy Land. And of course, here you can see some of the routes. This was a very dangerous, long trip. I mean, this was a trip where a significant portion of the people did not come back from this. Then there was the slightly safer trip to Santiago de Compostela, which is in Western Spain. This has become very popular again for people to walk. This was to see the supposed relics of St. James, the Apostle St. James. It started in several different places in France, all came together before the Pyrenees, and then people would walk over the Pyrenees and go into Spain to see the relics of St. James. Now, the one that was the sort of standard one that most people did was the pilgrimage to Rome because, well, for a lot of reasons. One, it was probably the easiest to do. The roads were already sort of established by the ancient Romans. They were just co-opted in the Middle Ages and reused. Rome was obviously the center of Christianity, and but also the popes kind of functioned in many ways as the supreme court of Europe at that time. And so, as you can see, there's many different routes over, over the mountains. This was tough going in those times, also by sea, and literally all roads led to Rome. And what this map doesn't show is that there were roads coming up from the south too. So this is a very extensive and very well-traveled pathway for people to make this pilgrimage. So let's think a little bit about this notion of pilgrimage, and it's helpful to think about this perhaps in terms of two very old pilgrimage sites. One is at Delphi. This is the Oracle of Apollo. And so this is a pilgrimage to something where you're not going to see the god. There's not remains of the god, but you're going to see God's intercessor on earth. Okay, the god Apollo, his oracle is going to tell you, something important about yourself. There's another kind of pilgrimage that we can see on the right, and this is the Great Stupa at Sanchi in India, and this is of course, a Buddhist shrine. And in this, because this is one of the oldest stupas, there is the belief that there are actual remains of the Buddha, okay, of the person who founds this great religion. And so this is a way you go in, or you don't go into the stupa, you circumambulate around it, and you ponder your own life in relationship to this. But the God in some remnant is still there. Now, this is a small problem with Christianity because our God is not still there. If you're a Christian, and I'm a lapsed Catholic myself, and because Jesus ascends into heaven, and that's where God in all of his forms are. So there's nothing left behind. So if you want to go and see remnants of Jesus, that's not possible while you're still alive. So this is a small problem for pilgrimage. So let's see. Well, who else do we have? Oh, the Virgin Mary. Whoops, we can't use her either because she is assumed into heaven. She also goes up into heaven. We have little bits and pieces of her hair in Rome and her nightshirt in France and things like that. And but again, there's no Mary there. So what are you going to do? Well, you're going to go see the next level of saints, and this could be apostles, but this could also be any kind of martyr, anyone who died for their faith. Okay, for being a Christian. And the thing about Rome is there were lots of them that died because the Romans they didn't specifically persecute Christians because they didn't like Christians. They were mad at the Christians because they didn't say that Rome was in charge. They said, no, our King Jesus is in charge. And that was a small problem to the Romans. So Rome was full of relics, full of bones, full of tangible remains that these are people in the time of Jesus or shortly after Jesus died for their faith. And so this was a hugely popular place to go visit. And of course, most of those bones were early on in the catacombs. They were in these underground burial places that not only were the Christians buried there, but all the Romans were buried there, Jews were buried there, all kinds of people were buried there. And so this became the beginnings of this very important pilgrimage to Rome. Now, eventually, the popes decide, well, the bones aren't really very safe because the catacombs are all outside the city walls, and they also want to get people into their churches in the city. So the bones pretty much all make their way into churches in Rome. So when you go to Rome today, there are lots of relics of very old martyrs, 2,000-year-old martyrs. And so this is I always show this to my students on Valentine's Day because here's poor old St. Valentine here moldering away for everyone to see. And this is in the Church of Santa Maria in Cosmedin. And this one we know for sure that Pope Nicholas IV brought this in at the end of the 13th century from the catacombs into the city of Rome. So this is very important because this shifts the pilgrimage traffic into the central part of the city. Okay, and so people no longer come and hang out on the outskirts, they come into the city. The other thing that starts happening, though, right around this time, again, the year 1300, it's a great year, and is that we have all of these modern day saints who are very charismatic. St. Francis, St. Dominic, St. Catherine of Siena, San Bernardino, all of these great preachers and charismatic saints. And so people early on start preserving parts of them for pilgrims to see. And so we start to have, bona fide body parts. And so we have poor old St. Catherine's head and her thumb that are in Siena. In Padua, we have St. Anthony's jaw and actually also his tongue. And then we have St. Margherita over here in Cortona, and we have all of her, sort of pretty well preserved. And so this becomes, again, this is even more tangible than a bone, right? The bone, you can say, is that really St. John's bone, arm bone? But here you can see it's tangible. That's people want some sort of tangibility in a religion which is based on faith. People still want some tangibility. You can have bones, you can have bodies, you can also have relics that are that somehow had contact with Jesus. Okay. And so we have holy stones and soil, holy dirt from the Holy Land here that Pope Nicholas III brought into Rome. We have the Scala Santa, which are supposedly the steps that Jesus walked across after sentencing from Pontius Pilate, and how the stairs got to Rome and everything is a little bit iffy, but there they are. We have the sudarium, or the veil of Veronica, that she supposedly wiped the face of Jesus and then his face shows up. And I'd hate to burst anyone's bubble, but the Catholic Church has said that this is no longer, she's no longer a saint, and this is not a valid relic. But that doesn't stop us from thinking that is pretty cool. We have images that themselves have powers. These are some of my favorites. They talk to people, so we have the crucifix on the right that talked to St. Francis. We have the image on the bottom left. She brought victory to the Sienese. The image on the top left has cured, I don't know how many people of how many things. And you can see they've put all these little extra crowns and everything on them. And so all of these things, again, the tangibility of them. And this is the great intersection here of art and religion. This is like stuff I love. So why does everybody want to go see all this stuff? Well, indulgences, of course. You get some time off your time, you get closer to heaven. You get time off your time in purgatory. We'll talk about that in a second. If you visit all of these places, you get, 5 years off for this saint, 100 years off from this saint, and more and more and more. And so people would visit and they would collect these things and still do. Okay. Indulgences are still very much a part of the modern Catholic Church. And what I show you here, this is on the right, is a little card that was, someone would pick up. It was a very inexpensive little, almost like the little prayer cards that you can still get in Catholic churches. And it would tell you what indulgences you would get if you were going to visit this particular image of the Virgin Mary. Over on the left, we have a whole record of the indulgences collected by this Austrian nobleman who very likely did not do the pilgrimage or jubilee himself, probably sent someone in his place, which you could do towards the year 1500, and was one of the many reasons why Martin Luther got so upset with the church. Martin Luther, no fan of indulgences. Now, again, why do you want all those indulgences? You want those indulgences so that you can go on the fast track through purgatory and get to heaven faster. Okay, that's what they will give you. So purgatory, this idea of this middle ground, purgatory is not limbo. Limbo is something separate and has been kind of hush-hushed by the church. But purgatory is this idea that you sort of do your time and repent your sins, and then you get to go to heaven. And so, our idea, our even late medieval and Renaissance ideas of purgatory are highly conditioned by Dante, because it's a searing, the Divine Comedy is a searing rendition of this whole hell, purgatory, heaven system. And I show you here, this is an image that's in the Florence Duomo or Cathedral, and we have Dante here always looking a little down in the dumps, probably because he was exiled from Florence. And then 150 years later, they paint this big painting of him. And they have Dante, here's hell. Uh-oh, they're all going down there. There's the devil right there. And here we have purgatory. And what purgatory is set up on these levels, and you sort of move up through these levels. And so if you have indulgences, you can move very quickly past these up to this top level that is basically the Garden of Eden. Okay, and then that is the jumping off point for going to paradise. Now here, because this was paid for by the Florentine government, paradise is replaced with Florence. That's very handy. You know, Florence as heaven. But in actuality, this is a wonderful 19th century Gustave Doré image of this beautiful sort of Gothic rose window structure that Dante creates in the Paradiso for heaven. And so that is the ultimate goal. And so that's why you want to collect all these indulgences. So again, our fast track, what's it like then for this pilgrim? Our fast track is what people are looking for. They're looking for lots of indulgences. So they want to go on a road and they want to go get there quickly and they want to go someplace where they're going to gather up a lot of these indulgences. And so the whole sort of creating of shrines and reliquaries and everything along this road became very important. And in particular, it became important in Siena, which is where my own program is based. And here you can see some renditions of what medieval pilgrims might have looked like. This shows this road, which we call the Via Francigena, that is the road from France. And it ends up in Rome is down sort of off the map here, but here you can see it's almost like a collection of roads. And this little signpost is now everywhere because this being a Jubilee year, there are pilgrims all the time on the Via Francigena making their way to Rome. And here you can see, I mean, if you have to go on a pilgrimage somewhere, you know, it's not so bad walk through Tuscany. This guy's getting ready to walk past a bunch of vineyards, and it's very, very beautiful. A number of my students have done parts of the Via Francigena that lead directly out of Siena. And in fact, you know, we very much encourage them, again, with this idea of pilgrimage for your own reasons, pilgrimage for your own goals and for your own introspection and with your own community. And this shows a student here from this summer sort of pensively looking off through this glorious country that is part of the pilgrimage route in Tuscany. Along the way, there were many places for pilgrims to stay. There was in Siena the most important hospital in Europe at the time, the Ospedale di Santa Maria della Scala. And this is a museum today, and it was just an absolutely extraordinary place. If you ever go to Siena, I highly recommend that you go here. They have parts of the old medieval road down in the bottom of the museum. It's really quite amazing. And then all of these paintings that sort of show people, you know, what this hospital, because it was a hospital, a hospice, a hotel, all of these things that come from the same root. It had many, many functions and was one of the most important stops along the way. So here we are now finally in Rome. You can see here's a pilgrim coming into Rome. There, of course, is the Dome of St. Peter's. And in Rome, there are many churches. There are many, many churches. So to make it easy, there were 7 major churches that pilgrims had to go visit. But 4 of these are the 4 major basilicas. And each of these today, even today, are now the focus of the Jubilee. And so whether you were a pilgrim in 1300 or whether you're going on the Jubilee in 2025, these were the 4 churches that were the focus of what you wanted to see. And all of these churches have very ancient roots to them. And here they are again, and they are St. Peter's, St. Paul's outside the walls, St. John Lateran, and St. John Lateran over here, and Santa Maria Maggiore. Now, these are all what we call basilican churches, and I'm not going to go into that too much, but a basilican church is a type of church that is basically the taken from ancient Rome, antiquity, and reconfigured from a Roman judicial building into a church. So the Christians took all most of their ideas from the ancient Romans, of course, because they were in amongst them. But one of the things I want you to note here is the old St. Peter's, here is the new St. Peter's. And one of the things that you can note is that these churches from the get-go were set up for a pilgrimage, okay, or a jubilee. Why do I say that? Well, the main part of the procession in Mass can go down this nave here, and we can have the Mass going on here or here. But then there are all these aisles that everybody can traipse around and go look at the tombs or relics that might be in the side there without disturbing the main part of the Mass. And this is a very important feature of any pilgrimage church, that you have these aisles to the side that allow for Mass to be said. And you might be looking for side chapels, but one of the things that you're most likely looking for in any church is the crypt. Okay, or the necropolis. If it's a very large crypt, we sometimes call it a necropolis. And usually there's some sort of access to this, from the church. And in fact, in St. Peter's, when you go in St. Peter's, there are two stairways here, and you can go down you can actually only now go down into this level. You have to get special permission to go down to the lowest level. But in the old days, in 1300, you could go down and visit this quite freely. And this, again, this is where the relics are. This is where people are buried. These are the bones you want to see. And of course, at St. Peter's, I mean, the ultimate goal of the pilgrim or the person participating in Jubilee is to see St. Peter, right? To see the burial site of St. Peter. If you're a believer, that is very important. And there is an ancient Roman necropolis down there. There are people buried from about the time that Peter would have lived. Again, we don't have any real proof, but it's suggestive. Okay, and so this all takes place underneath here. These are all of the little burial sites you can see under the modern plan of Rome. And this is because this was originally a sort of like a circus, almost like the Colosseum or the Circus Maximus. And there would have been people who died in the various Roman entertainments, and they would have had a nice handy burial site for them right nearby. So, that it could be that this is where St. Peter is buried. And just in case you didn't know that, they made it very clear for us that this is the case. And so when you're in the upper church, there's like literally a big X marks the spot. There's Bernini's giant bronze gilded baldacchino here over the spot. Oh, and in case you weren't sure about that, there's Michelangelo's dome also right over the spot. It's like Peter is here. He's right here. And so you're not gonna miss out on that whatsoever. Okay. So pilgrimage, that's what a jubilee is, but it's a very special type of pilgrimage, okay? And this is an image from not the current jubilee, but one of the earlier ones. And this year, again, it was the Jubilee of Hope. That was what was proclaimed by Pope Francis. Now, again, to recap, 1300, this is the first Christian jubilee. And this is Pope Boniface VIII. And again, Pope Boniface VIII, a piece of work, for sure. Super interesting. My students are fascinated by him. But he calls the first Jubilee. So what is this exactly? And what it is here's we still have the papal bull, we still have the document. Here you can see the little wax seal on here. That copies of these were sent around all over. He announces this Jubilee, and he announces it as a plenary indulgence. That is, if you get yourself to Rome and you go to these churches, you get a clean slate. All your sins are wiped clean. And so for instance, if you happen to go get a plenary indulgence and you died on the spot, I guess you wouldn't even go to purgatory, right? You go straight to heaven. So it was a very popular idea. Okay, it was a very popular idea. The year 1300, this is a time people were worried about the end of the world, and there was a lot of unrest. Well, sounds familiar. And so again, salvation was something that people were very much looking forward to. And so we have this wonderful image here This is of the first papal jubilee. It was created when it was written about 100 years later. But I just love this image because these are all sort of supposed to be renditions of buildings in Rome, and all of these little pilgrims here, they all have their pilgrim staff, okay, and you can see them all coming down, and there are more of them coming around the hills outside of Rome, and everybody's coming. And everybody's talking to each other. And so, this notion of meeting people along the road, meeting people in Rome, forming communities. This is an essential part of any pilgrimage, but especially of a jubilee. But again, everyone very interested in getting that plenary indulgence. So, as you can imagine, the popes went sort of crazy about decorating Rome, okay, making it fit. And this is something that still happens today. Rome has a problem with garbage pickup, and there was not a shred of garbage anywhere this summer. It was all cleaned up. It was sort of amazing. I remember the Jubilee of 2000, there were just seas of porta potties because there's never bathrooms anywhere in Italy. It's the great mystery. And there were seas of porta potties. So these things happen. And one of the things that happens around this time is that the Pope gets a young artist by the name of Giotto to come in and make this massive, huge mosaic in the atrium of Old St. Peter's that people would see as they were leaving, and it was the story of basically Peter not feeling as though he had the faith to walk in the water. It's called the Navicella, or the little boat, and it was one of the most famous images in Europe, and it's absolutely huge. Now, for years, have been trying to tell my students how big this thing is, and they're like, how big is it? And I hit upon an idea, and that is, think of it as a Bucky sign, okay? Think of it as the size of a Bucky sign. In fact, these giant Bucky signs that are everywhere, it's smaller than this mosaic. Okay, the Bucky sign is 14 feet by 48 feet, and the mosaic was 40, well, is a little, not quite as wide, but it was hugely deeper. So I have to say that I was successful in making them impressed after I showed them Bucky's. Everyone likes some excess. Okay, so again, 1300, such an amazing year. So Boniface calls for the Jubilee. Of all people, Dante probably goes to Rome, probably as an emissary of Florence. He was he was a prior for the city of Florence before they kicked him out and sentenced him to death. And he goes there, and that's when he decides he really doesn't like Boniface, not really because of the Jubilee, but Boniface is trying to usurp temporal power also. Boniface is trying to say, I'm not just in charge of the religion, I'm in charge of the whole world. And Dante has a problem with that. So, and then Dante actually ends up setting the entire Divine Comedy in the year 1300. It's right in the year 1300. So this is clearly a pivotal year. And here he is, he and Virgil, they're down in the Inferno, and this is another Pope, Pope Nicholas III, who was infamous for giving away a lot of appointments to his nephews. The Italian word for nephew is nipote, which nepotism. And and Nicholas can't see anything, and so because he's upside down, and he hears people coming, and he goes, "Hey, Boniface, is that you?" So Dante, it's very clever because he throws some shade to Boniface without Boniface even really technically being dead in the year 1300 yet. So they shenanigans. Boniface dies in total disgrace. He has this terrible overreach, and the story was he gnawed his hands off at the end. I don't know if that's true. And essentially, what happens is the papacy falls apart and moves to France. Okay, the south of France. Why not? Let's go to the south of France. And Boniface becomes the guy who starts the Jubilee, becomes this poster boy for the bad papacy. And so by the time you get around to the pre-Reformation or the Reformation years, it was almost always Boniface or the contemporary Pope who was shown as the bad guy. So he's usurping the power of kings is the issue here. There's not that separation of church and state, and there really wasn't. Finally, in 1377, an illiterate young woman from Siena, St. Catherine of Siena, it's just extraordinary, goes to the Pope and says, you need to get back to Rome. And she must have been very forceful because the Pope gets back to Rome. Well, it's a sort of back and forth because Rome had become fairly lawless at this time, but eventually the Pope settles back in Rome. And what ends up happening is they decide, hey, let's resurrect that idea of the Jubilee and get a lot of people down here and kind of remind everybody that this is where the papacy is. So in 1423, we have the sort of first Jubilee post Boniface. And this is called by Pope Martin the Fifth, shown over here on the right. And he starts the tradition of the Holy Doors. Okay. And the Holy Doors is essentially when you walk through the Holy Doors, and for him it was St. John Lateran, that's how you get your plenary indulgence. Okay. So you have to come down to Rome, you have to repent of your sins, but then you have to walk through the Holy Doors, and then you would get this plenary indulgence. Well, this idea became, again, hugely popular. We start to get the revival of the Jubilee again. And we have so many people come to Rome for a Jubilee in 1450 that the main bridge over to the Vatican, the Ponte Sant'Angelo, collapses and thousands of people die and are drowned because nobody can swim. And so that's not a good point. So the popes realized they have to start refurbishing the city if they're going to have all these people coming. And so this is, again, the sort of not only the beginning of the Jubilee, but the beginning of this idea of creating this papal city that we still see today. In 1500, Pope Alexander VI, the Borgia Pope, played by Jeremy Irons in the TV show, decides to have all the other papal basilicas also have holy doors. So he opens the holy doors in Santa Maria Maggiore. He has the holy doors open in San Paolo, St. Paul's, outside the walls. Here you can see a cardinal at the holy doors for this year's Jubilee. And then, of course, he has the holy doors open at St. Peter's. And when I mean open, after the Jubilee, the holy doors are shut and the covers are cemented in, so that no one can accidentally open the holy doors. Okay, they have to come in and take out the cement so that the holy doors can be reopened. So this is a big deal. And here you can see poor Francis. He must have been so very ill at this time. We have Francis initiating the current Jubilee on Christmas Eve, December 24th, 2024. Here, and this is the opening of the holy doors in St. Peter's. And here you can see people filing in. If you're an official Jubilee pilgrimage group, you get to carry one of these official Jubilee crucifixes in. So, 4 holy doors. Sometimes the Pope will add other holy doors for plenary indulgences. For the Jubilee of Mercy, he had a door to a prison in Rome. In other Jubilees, they've opened holy doors in other cities in case people were too ill to come in. But this year, it was just the 4 holy doors of the 4 papal basilicas in Rome. And as you can see, it's a sort of unfolding ceremony. And there's the St. Peter's is first, then St. John Lateran, because that is actually the Cathedral of Rome, not St. Peter's. St. Peter's is a basilica. Then we have Santa Maria Maggiore. And this has recently been in the news because this is where Pope Francis was buried. He was buried not at St. Peter's, but at Santa Maria Maggiore. And then we have, always the last one, St. Paul's outside the walls because it's a little bit farther to get to. And so that one is open then right at Epiphany, at the beginning of Epiphany. And each one is opened by what we call the archpriest of that particular basilica. And of course, the archpriest of St. Peter's is the Pope. And then usually he does St. John Lateran too, not always, and then we had probably, especially since Francis was so ill, we had these other priests opening the doors. And so it is through these doors that you process if you want your sins forgiven, okay? So what is the deal here? You can't just process through the holy doors. And I had to explain this to my students who all wanted to do the holy doors. And you'll see that there was a snag with that. And I said, no, that's I mean, I can't stop you from doing it, but you really can't just parade through. So what you have to do is be in the proper state, okay? And recognize that it is an act of devotion. Okay, and that an devotion, an act of devotion is basically just an active type of prayer. And so you have to first have confession or reconciliation, we now call in this country. You must receive communion. This is either the confession has to happen before you go through, right? You've got to confess those sins first, then you get to go through. And then either before or after you receive Holy Communion, you have to pray for the Pope. Okay. This certainly was something people were doing while Francis was so ill. And then to actually activate this plenary indulgence, you must be sincerely free from all attachment to sin. That doesn't mean that you're never going to sin again, because we're human beings, right? We all sin. We all, especially the venial sins, man, those are really hard to avoid, right? Envy or, I don't know what, anger seems to be the sin du jour. Those, but you have to say, okay, I'm going to actively try to renounce them. Okay. And if you are in this proper state, you can then walk through the doors and receive your plenary indulgence. If you believe. I think that, again, my students wanted to do it, I think just for the experience, certainly. So, in fact, we never really got to go through the, the doors. And for the first time ever, we didn't even get to go into St. Peter's, much to my great unhappiness. And I was being very unhappy the day that we couldn't get in. No one could tell us why we couldn't get in. It was on June 9th, and we all sat around disgruntled. And then finally we went on and looked at many of the other myriad glories of the city of Rome. And it turns out this is why our new Pope decided that he was going to lead his papal curia, that is his new papal court, in through the doors, and that they were going to do their own jubilee. They were going to do their own, presumably they don't have to worry as much about sins, but they were going to do this. And you can see, and I love this picture because, the new Pope, well, he's my age, he's 69, and I love because everybody always says, oh, he's so young. It's only in the context of popes is 69 young. But you can see him there quite vigorously walking ahead of his papal curia, who look like they're struggling to keep up with him. And then those, of course, are the Swiss guards that are still wearing their uniforms designed by Michelangelo. And they're quite something. But he decided that this was just a few weeks after he had become Pope, that he wanted to, in the spirit of Jubilee, it was Pentecost weekend, and do this. And so that's why we didn't get in. So I'm feeling a little less annoyed with him right now. So I'd like to finish up this with just thinking for a minute about the whole process of Jubilee, because I spend a lot of time every summer with my students. I often teach classes on the pilgrimage, and I did this summer. We taught about pilgrimage and what does pilgrimage mean, and what are some of the aspects of pilgrimage or aspects of the Jubilee that we can incorporate into our life. And so one of the things that I talk to them about, and this can be both in terms of a religious pilgrimage, but it can also be in terms of their own experience, and that is, what do we do? How can we make this experience of travel not just be, checking off something of our list, but something that can be transformative? Because this is what we want. This is what pilgrims wanted on a pilgrimage, and this is what pilgrims want on a jubilee. And so I think about this and I talk to them about it. And, one of the things is, thinking about planning it and the pleasures and the importance of this sort of stopping and thinking about what you're going to do, the sort of delayed gratification of planning something. These young people are, they're not necessarily very good at that, and they don't always see the importance, and they've been told a million times to live in the moment. But really thinking about, okay, why am I going to go over here and do this? As I did have some students who were very devout. For those students, this was important for religious reasons. For many others, it was important for other reasons. Um, think about the journey, both ahead of the time and while you're in it. Okay, really ponder this. And, that is something that these students can do. That is something that pilgrims can do, because as they're walking along the path, because this involves time and effort, and a certain amount of aching muscles and everything else to kind of walk this path, to deal with the crowds. Think about the journey. For these young people, I want them to really think beyond Instagram tourism. I want them to think about, to put themselves perhaps in the shoes of a medieval pilgrim, but also just to think about the journey and this whole experience, and not just collect Instagram moments. I really want them to build a community. And again, that can be both something that a pilgrim can do, that can be something that you can do on Jubilee. But this is something that these kids also do. We take 25 very disparate kids. We have quite a few of our own majors in art and art history, but we have business majors and math majors and pre-meds and advertising. And by the end of 6 weeks, they are a cohesive group. They have found this sense of community that I think is sometimes difficult for them, can be difficult for them at a place as large as at UT. But we also really want them to stop and reflect about their own goals and dreams. And again, this can be a pilgrim, or this can be our students, and how I think that for these kids, this is particularly important, because we really need to think about their time at UT as being this very liminal time, this sort of threshold between the time they're with their family and their childhood and before they go out into the grown-up world. And so time to think about, is this what I really want to do? Do I really want to be a pre-med major? It's like, oh, if you decide not to, please don't go home and tell your parents. But what are your goals and how are these going to work for you? And here you have the time and space, and also some distance from your own environment. And this, it seems, is something that can work for a pilgrim. It can work for someone on Jubilee. It can work for my students. And quite honestly, it can work for any of us. I find that I have time to think about my own life and what it is I'm doing. Every year, I remove myself from my environment and go to Italy with these 25 kids, different kids every year, but 25 kids. Um, Finally, is if you're interested, I have put together several resources here for you. Some of them are a little more academic, some of them are guidebooks. I've particularly enjoyed this book by Timothy Egan. He's a New York Times reporter, and he was, he's sort of wavering in his faith, and he decides to do the pilgrimage, and it's quite an interesting and entertaining read from this. But these are some sources that I have found useful and you might find useful. So thank you for your time. And now I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Johns. All right, we do have a few questions from our participants today. The first one is, were the plans for the Jubilee altered when Pope Francis died and was succeeded by Pope Leo?
That's a great question. No, they were not. Okay, this was already, so the Jubilee had already started in at Christmas Eve. And everyone knew that Francis was ill, and everyone wondered what is going to happen. But the Jubilee continued. The only thing being, of course, is that the Sistine Chapel was closed for a few days as they were choosing the new pope. But if you remember, that happened very quickly. And lo and behold, to everyone's surprise, we got an American pope.
The next one is, what miracles, if any, have occurred during a Jubilee pilgrimage?
Oh, well, most of the that's also a great question because, you know, the documented miracles tend to be ones that we associate with a particular saint, okay? Because this is, so say Saint Catherine. I hope I don't go off on a wild hair here. Um, there are rules to becoming a saint, and so you need sort of tangible proof. Saint Catherine did these saints while she was still alive. She did these saints posthumously, and if she did this and she has this and this and this, then she can become a saint. Um, in terms of the ordinary things that happen to ordinary people, those are not always known. You know, the ordinary things, this is something that we don't have very many records of. We do have, particularly in the Middle Ages, once we get to more around the early modern period, in the Renaissance, 1500, we do have more sort of diaries and journals from travelers who talk about usually the sorts of miracles they want when they're on pilgrimage is to, you know, their legs hurt, right? And so they've gotten wounded or they've had all their money stolen by somebody, and they're those sorts of things. And we do have some of those, but in terms of the major miracles, those are usually going to be a sort of constellation around the individual saints.
All right, next one. What's the difference between this Jubilee and others in other years where local churches have holy doors?
Well, you know, that's a little bit of a mystery. That's a great question. I'm not really sure why the Pope decided this year, and that would be Pope Francis, not to do those other doors. And what they've done instead is they said that if you cannot get to Rome, there are other things that you can do. You can go visit a local church and you can talk to a priest and you can still, if you believe, get this plenary indulgence, but you have to go sort of along different routes. It's a mystery to everyone why he didn't do that. The other thing is that once I got over there, so I had heard this because in other Jubilee years, there's been churches in other places in Italy that had the holy doors. Once I got over there, then there were these sort of mysterious Jubilee churches. So, for instance, the St. Catherine's Basilica in Siena was a Jubilee church, but there weren't the holy doors, but they were. So, I would say that was a lot of confusion about that, but there are some things you can do through your local parish to get the plenary indulgence if you are not able to get to Rome.
I think we have time for two more. One is just sort of a point of clarification from someone. They say, I thought indulgences were to relive the temporal effects of sin, not the forgiveness of sins, which is done in confession.
The indulgences, that may be one interpretation of it. And again, I am not a theologian, but I know the reason that people, according to Dante, and according to most medieval and Renaissance accounts, you would get the indulgence, and that would forgive the sin. Okay, so I don't think that you might have to I don't think the reliving of sin, that may be a newer theological that I'm not as familiar with, but no, the indulgences were the wiping your, so the plenary indulgence wipes your slate clean. However, you still have to go to confession. So, I mean, that's a really good point. That's a little confusing.
All right, let's last one here. I think this is interesting. Do you think that the mantra of living in the moment undermines the value of intentionality in your students?
Oh, goodness. Yeah, I could talk forever about this. I think I don't envy them in many ways. You know, I think that the tyranny of the phones and the Instagram and In the old days, we used to have bad cell phone connection when we get to Italy, and now, everybody's got their phones and everybody does all this. And I think it's hard for them because I think they're also our students are really smart, and they're also really aware of things going on in the world. And they are really aware that there's been at least a perceived downturn in terms of employment opportunities. So I think that what they hear are different, are opposite messages. Live in the moment, have fun, but worry about getting a job, affording a house, that sort of thing. And so I find that if they just have some time and space to maybe either, it depends on who I'm teaching with, either do some drawings or take photographs, and we have time to look at things and time to talk, that it's extraordinarily healthy for everyone involved, and to really talk to other students outside of their own majors and kind of find out what people are thinking about things, get a little bit broader perspective. But no, they are absolutely receiving contradictory messages, and it's I feel a responsibility as someone who really focuses on undergraduates to listen to them and to not dismiss them. I'll just say, oh, this is Gen Z. Because I think they are inheriting a very complicated world.
Well, that's about all our time for today. I really want to thank you, Dr. Johns. This was fascinating. Thanks everyone for joining us today. Our lunchtime lecture series is going to continue on August 27th with Dr. Maya Henry and her lecture entitled A Loss for Words, How Aphasia Steals Language. So we will see y'all in August. Hook 'em horns.